d4, queen's pawn opening, opening line. The queen's pawn opening move is somewhat slower than the popular e4 because white will not be able to castle for 3 more moves. Its advantage is that it gives white more control over tactical surprises and often provides more lasting initiative and pressure. Knight f6, Indian defense, opening line. The immediate development of the knight is the most supple response to the queen's pawn opening, allowing transposition into virtually every type of defense at black's disposal. Knight f3, Indian defense, Toray attack, opening line. The Toray attack is characterized by white's second and third moves, knight f3 and bishop g5. White avoids several defenses that would be possible after 2c4 and prepares a kingside attack along the lines of the Kali opening. g6, Indian defense, Toray attack, pseudo-king's Indian, opening line. This is one of several common ways to enter the king's Indian defense posture for black. Yet to be decided are the related defenses, the Yugoslav variation, levering the center with c5, or Benoni defense, or Grunfeld defense. c4, Indian defense, Toray attack, pseudo-king's Indian, opening line. Bishop g7, Indian defense, opening line. Knight c3, Indian defense, king's Indian defense, transposed, opening line. Castle kingside, Indian defense, king's Indian defense, opening line. e4, Indian defense, king's Indian defense, transposed, opening line. d6, Indian defense, king's Indian defense, classical variation, transposed, opening line. Bishop e2, Indian defense, king's Indian defense, opening line. e5, Indian defense, king's Indian defense, opening line. Castle kingside, Indian defense, king's Indian defense, opening line. E takes d4, out of opening book. Knight b d7 would have been in the Indian defense, king's Indian defense, opening line. Knight takes d4, removes the threat on white's knight at c3. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Rook e8. f3. c6. King h1. Knight b d7. Bishop g5 pins black's knight at f6 and blocks black's pawn at g6. Queen b6 releases black's knight at f6 from the pin and attacks white's pawn at b2. Knight b3 removes the threat on white's pawn at b2 and attacks black's pawn at d6. a5. Knight a4 attacks black's queen and blocks black's pawn at a5. Queen b4 moves it to safety, removes the threat on black's pawn at d6 and attacks white's knight at a4. Knight c1 protects white's knight at a4. Knight c5 blocks white's pawn at c4. Knight takes c5 blocks black's pawn at c6. Queen takes c5 protects black's pawn at d6, threatens white's bishop at g5 and blocks white's pawn at c4. Black wins a knight for a knight. Material is even. Queen d2 removes the threat on White's bishop at g5. Knight d7 pins White's pawn at b2. Rook b1 releases White's pawn at b2 from the pin. f5. Knight d3 attacks Black's queen. Queen d4 moves it to safety and partially pins White's knight. Bishop e3. Slightly better is e takes f5. Diagnosing. The chess master recommends pawn takes pawn. Your pawn captures pawn. Black counters with knight to c5, which blocks your pawn at c4. You move your pawn to f6, which moves it out of immediate jeopardy, attacks Black's bishop at g7, and creates a passed pawn on f6. Black answers with bishop captures pawn. Your bishop captures bishop, which attacks Black's queen. Black counters with queen takes bishop. Your knight takes knight, which blocks Black's pawn at c6. Black responds with pawn captures knight. You move your bishop to d3. Black responds by moving rook to d8, which pins your bishop. You move your queen to c2, which releases the pin on your bishop. Black responds by moving the bishop to f5, which partially pins your bishop. Your bishop takes bishop. Black responds with queen captures bishop, which attacks your queen. Your queen captures queen, which attacks Black's pawn at c5. Black counters with pawn takes queen, which removes the threat on Black's pawn at c5. As a result of this line of play, you win a queen, 2 bishops, a knight, and a pawn, for a queen, 2 bishops, a knight, and a pawn. In addition, the mobility of Black's pieces is greatly decreased. Also, Black's pawn formation is disrupted. Finally, the pressure on your king is eliminated. Bishop e3. Slightly better is e takes f5. Queen f6. Slightly better is queen takes c4. Thinking. The chess master recommends queen captures pawn at c4. Your queen captures pawn at c4, which attacks White's pawn at a2. White counters with knight to e5, which forks your queen and your pawn at d6. You move your queen to b4, which moves it out of harm's way and protects your pawn at d6. White counters by moving the bishop to c4, which protects White's knight and checks your king. You move your king to f8, which moves it out of check and attacks White's knight. White responds with knight captures knight, which checks your king. Your bishop captures knight, which protects your king and attacks White's bishop at c4. White counters with the queen to c2, which removes the threat on White's bishop at c4. You move your pawn to b5, which threatens White's bishop at c4. White answers with bishop to d3, which moves it to safety. You move your king to g8. White replies by moving the pawn to a3, which threatens your queen. you move your queen to a4, which moves it out of immediate jeopardy and blocks white's pawn at a3. As a result of this line of play, you win a knight and a pawn for a knight. Additionally, white's mobility is slightly decreased. Also, the development of your pawns is improved, and the development of white's pawns is somewhat weakened. Queen f6. Slightly better is queen takes c4. Knight f2. Knight c5. Blocks white's pawn at c4. Bishop f4. Blocks black's pawn at f5. F takes e4. Knight takes e4. Attacks black's queen. Knight takes e4. Removes the threat on black's queen and attacks white's queen. F takes e4. Protects white's queen. Rook takes e4. Black wins a knight and 2 pawns for a knight and a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Bishop d3. Threatens black's rook at e4. Rook e8. Moves it to safety. Bishop h6. Attacks black's queen and blocks black's pawn at h7. Queen d4. Moves it to safety. Bishop takes g7. Attacks black's queen. Queen takes g7. Black wins a bishop for a bishop. Black is ahead by a pawn. Queen f4. Threatens black's pawn at d6. Bishop e6. Queen takes d6. White wins a pawn. Material is even. Rook a d8. Skewers white's queen and attacks white's queen. Queen a3. Slightly better is queen g3. Evaluating. The chess master recommends queen to g3. You move your queen to g3, which moves it to safety. Black responds by moving the bishop to c8. You move your rook at b1 to e1. Black counters with rook captures rook, which pins your rook at f1 with a partial pin. Your queen captures rook, which disengages the pin on your rook and threatens black's pawn at a5. Black answers with queen takes pawn, which attacks your pawn at a2 and isolates your pawn at c4 and your pawn at a2. You move your queen to e7, which attacks black's rook. Black counters by moving the queen to d4, which removes the threat on black's rook. You move your rook to f7. Black responds by moving the queen to a1, which forks your pawn at a2 and your king. You move your bishop to f1, which moves it out of immediate jeopardy, protects your king, and attacks black's rook. Black responds with pawn to b6. As a result of this sequence of moves, your mobility is enhanced, and the mobility of black's pieces is decreased. Additionally, the pressure on black's king is increased. Queen a3. Slightly better is queen g3. Queen d4. Rook b d1. Bishop takes c4. Pins white's bishop with a partial pin. Bishop takes c4. Check. Forks black's king and black's queen. Queen takes c4. Removes the threat on black's king. Queen takes a5. Rook takes d1. Threatens mate. Rook takes rook. Partially pins white's rook at f1 and attacks white's rook at f1 with 2 pieces. Rook takes d1. White wins a rook, a bishop, and a pawn for a rook, a bishop, and a pawn. Material is even. Queen c2. Forks white's pawn at b2 and white's rook. Rook f1. Slightly better is rook e1. Analyzing. The chessmaster recommends rook to e1. You move your rook to e1, which moves it out of immediate jeopardy and attacks black's rook. Black answers with rook captures rook, which checks your king. You are forced to move queen captures rook, which protects your king. Black responds by moving the king to f7. You move your queen to a1, which protects your pawn at b2. Black replies by moving pawn to c5. You move your pawn to h3. Black replies by moving king to e6. You move your pawn to b3. Black counters with the queen to e2. You move your pawn to a3. Black responds with the pawn to b6. You move your queen to c3, which takes the queen out of the corner of the board. Black responds by moving pawn to h6. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a rook for a rook. Additionally, black's attack potential is greatly decreased. Also, the pressure on black's king is somewhat increased. Rook f1. Slightly better is rook e1. Queen takes b2. Creates a passed pawn on c6 and isolates white's pawn at a2. Black wins a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Queen c7 hangs the pawn at a2. Leads to queen f2, rook g1, rook e1, queen d8, check, king g7, queen d7, check, king h6, queen h3, check, king g5, queen g3, check, queen takes g3, h takes g3, rook takes g1, check, king takes g1, b5, king f1, c5, king e2, king g4, king f2, c4, a3, which wins a queen and a rook for a queen and a rook. Better is queen a4, leading to rook f8, rook d1, rook f7, queen c4, king g7, rook e1, h6, a4, queen d2, rook e8, which results in no captures. This was white's only meaningful error. Even though the game was within reach here, white eventually resigned. Queen f2. Threatens mate, queen captures rook, and threatens white's rook. Rook g1. Moves it out of harm's way. Rook e1. Threatens checkmate, rook captures rook. Queen d8, check. Removes the threat on white's pawn at a2, checks black's king, and takes control of the open file. King g7. Moves it out of check, threatens checkmate. Rook captures rook, and threatens white's pawn at a2. Queen d7 check. Protects white's pawn at a2 and forks black's king and black's pawn at b7. King h6. Moves it out of check, threatens checkmate. Rook takes rook and attacks white's pawn at a2. Queen h3 check. Removes the threat on white's pawn at a2 and checks black's king. King g5. Moves it out of check, threatens checkmate. Rook captures rook and attacks white's pawn at a2. Queen g3 check. Skewers black's queen, protects white's pawn at a2 and forks black's king and black's queen. Queen takes g3. Protects black's king and blocks white's pawn at g2. H takes g3. Attacks black's rook. Rook takes g1 check. Checks white's king. King takes g1. White wins a queen and a rook. For a queen and a rook. Black is up a pawn. King g4. Attacks white's pawn at g3 and blocks white's pawn at g3. White resigns. Thinking. The chessmaster recommends king to g4. You move your king to g4, which attacks white's pawn at g3 and blocks white's pawn at g3. White replies by moving the king to f2, which protects white's pawn at g3. You move your pawn to b5. White answers with king to e3. You move your pawn to c5, which pushes the passed pawn. White counters by moving the king to e4. Your king takes pawn, which threatens white's pawn at g2 and blocks white's pawn at g2. White counters with the king to d5, which attacks your pawn at c5. You move your pawn to c4, which moves it to safety and pushes the passed pawn. White responds by moving the king to d4. You move your pawn to h5. White responds by moving pawn to a4, which threatens your pawn at b5. Your pawn takes pawn, which creates a passed pawn on a4. White answers with king captures pawn. You move your pawn to g5. White responds by moving king to b4, which threatens your pawn at a4. You move your pawn to g4. White counters with king takes pawn. You move your pawn to h4. White responds with king to b5. Your king takes pawn, which creates passed pawns on g4 and h4. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win 3 pawns for 2 pawns. Additionally, the development of your pawns is stronger. King g4 attacks white's pawn at g3 and blocks white's pawn at g3. White